So good evening, everyone. It's nice to see you all on this lovely rainy evening in Armonk, New York. This evening, we're going to be looking at two things in this session of our class on the theology of Armenian architecture. First thing that we're going to be looking at is what did Armenians understand by the term that many of us are familiar with, universal church? And then how did the structure of their church buildings reflect this understanding? So, basilical churches, as we saw last time, with their sense of a kind of progression or even a procession towards the courtroom that was located at the far end, we're going to dominate Armenian church architecture for the first century and a half or so after Armenia's conversion to Christianity. Although both exteriorly and interiorly, Armenian basilicas were simpler than the quite large and beautiful ones in the Western sphere. Whether that smaller, simpler format was chosen as a matter of practicality or as a matter of philosophy, it's hard to tell. However, as Armenian Christianity began to differentiate itself, to manifest its own indigenous qualities, the basilica was no longer really sufficient to express those qualities, to express the essence of Armenian Christian faith. Why not? We who are heirs to the Byzantine and Roman traditions tend to find a lot of value in letting our minds wander off untethered into the world of unembodied ideas and reasoning and speculation and all of these things. We cultivate the ability to do this well. We love to follow our ideas to their logical conclusion. Whether or not that conclusion has any application in reality is beside the point. And very often, for most of us, the only connection that there is between our precious musings and our body is the brain, which we treat as if it were functioning on its own, in isolation from the rest of us. Armenians, by contrast, prefer not to do that. Armenians prefer their ideas to be tethered in one way or another to the rest of the physical world. After all, as Armenians began discovering about themselves, their faith, the focus of their Christianity, is on the incarnation. It's a focus not on the idea of the incarnation, but the incarnation itself as an actuality, as God's chosen vehicle for coming among us. The body and the physical world in which it moves, the space-time fabric through which it moves, was a vehicle for the divine and continues to be so as a united whole. And I think it's this Armenian preference for maintaining the body as a kind of a blessing tether, valuing the body for the way that it allows us to connect spirit with the external world. That preference has driven, I believe, the great change in Armenian church architecture that we are going to observe this evening. For Armenians, the church is the universe. Having said that, when a Western mind hears the term universal church, it considers the phrase to be actually reversible. The universal church, the church universal, should all be kind of the same. And in this view, the church is universal because people everywhere, universally, are classified equally on the basis of whether or not they accept teachings that are considered to be applicable to all. So here are three definitions of the universal church, or the church universal, that I just garnered from the internet, from many that were available there. The first one says, the church universal includes every believer in the world, no matter what denomination, that's quite generous, and excludes every non-believer, even if they go to a Bible teaching church. So there's a kind of aspect of community identification that comes with the universal church. Second one says, the universal church is comprised of all those who have been born of the Spirit of God and who have, by that same Spirit, been baptized by the Holy Spirit into the body of Christ. That one's a little bit more arcane for people who are not steeped in St. Paul. Nonetheless, it's a way of identifying a group of people. And then we have this one. The Roman Church is the universal church because it teaches the fullness of the faith and is a sign of the continuous leadership established by St. Peter. In other words, whether we look at the universal church / the church universal from a more parochial point of view as a Roman Catholic or from a broader point of view, it doesn't really matter, because what is being done here is to apply to everyone a certain set of principles that are a litmus test for whether or not an individual or group is part of the universal church. And I was interested to see online that several actual entities have claimed universal as part of their church's name. So I found the Universal Life Church, the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God, the Universal Church of the Master. In other words, there's a universal applicability of the teachings of this group, whatever it is, or alternatively, there's a universal openness to membership, as perhaps we might think with the Unitarian Universalist Church. So the idea of universality is an idea. It's an idea based on the acceptance of ideas. To an Armenian, however, the word universal and the term universal church sounds very different, literally and in terms of understanding. In Armenian, universal church is Diazeragania Gevetsi. Literally, well, we'll come back to that. And this word universal, Diazeragan, is used in three different ways. Derives from the word diazer, which roughly translates cosmos, but it literally means the edge of daylight. It's used in Luke 2, verse 1, to describe a localized governmental jurisdiction. An edict went out that all the diezirk should be taxed, obviously not meaning the universe, but meaning the group or the region under the jurisdiction of a certain government. So the idea of universality from the beginning is much more limited in Armenian than it is in its English application. The second way that the word diezirk is used is found in Luke 21:26, where we are told that there will be terrifying things taking place in the diezirk, in other words, the world, literally the globe or a large portion thereof. Again, it doesn't mean the universe, the vast expanse of interstellar space. Most often in scripture, the word diezirk is applied to the physical creation, quite simply. God made the diezirk. God made physical creation. Now, this makes for a very interesting difference between the Western and Armenian understanding, because to an Armenian's mind, the universal church would be one that reflects the universe, not one that is applicable to the universe, but one that reflects the universe, or perhaps includes the physical creation and its underlying principles within it. So if we look at it from this point of view, there's an automatic puzzle here. How do you include all of physical creation within a building? How do you get everything that God made into a single space? And this puzzle was not easily resolved with the tools that were available to the early church architectural repertoire. A basilica church is not going to accomplish this. Basilicas were wonderfully expressive of, and in fact, you could almost say that they reveled in the distance between God and man, God and creation. And even smaller basilicas, they didn't have to be that big, even smaller basilicas stressed the importance of the worshiper moving reverently towards the presence of the judge who is seated at the end of the basilica as awesomely other than we are. And that's a beautiful way to look at it. However, for Armenians are enthralled not by the otherness of God, that's a given. They are enthralled by the nearness of God, by the way that the incarnation of the divine presence, the immeasurable divine presence among us within our limited sphere of being, had actually closed, not even closed, but obliterated the distance between us and God, between the human and the divine. The way that humanity itself, both individually and collectively, thanks to the incarnation and the coming of the Holy Spirit, became the dwelling space of God in actuality. For Armenians, the human connection to God is immediate, not sequential. It's vertical, not horizontal. It's not a progress, if you like, it's a realization. Okay, so a basilica does not express that idea. And how did Armenians then transition away from basilical church structures? How did this transition come about? Well, I'll tell you from the outset that we, or at least I, don't know exactly how. Don't know the names of any specific people who were involved in this transition. But we are very fortunate to be able to actually see it happen, and maybe even to pinpoint the moment when it happens, or at least a moment when it happened. There may have been other moments that are now lost to us that we have no idea about. Okay, so to begin our look at the transition away from the Basilical Church, we have to move to the very far western edge of present-day Armenia. And some of you may have been to this place. I have not, because it sits in an area that is sometimes a military zone. And if you can imagine Armenia's western boundary as a face, this ancient church, Saint Garabed in Yereruk, sits exactly on the nose of the face. So you can see how very, very close it is to the Turkish border as it is today. A few months ago, a group of Armenians from the Armenian Democratic Liberal Party launched a campaign to plant Armenian flags in border communities just to stake their claim to the territory. And they planted a flag here at Yereruk. You can see what remains of this once massive basilica behind them, and they give you a sense of scale. As a basilica with 3 aisles, Yereruk was once a glorious structure, but it's now mostly in ruins. You can see the most important features of its architecture: the triple door, the 2 windows above the entrances, the 3 windows surmounting that. The idea of multiple piercings of the facade is something that we will come back to. But the remaining architectural features of this church can be seen from what is left. So it's been reconstructed on this kind of a plan. It's typical basilica. And the architectural remains of little sculptured decorations show us very clean, strong lines. This is not a fancy, flourishy kind of decor. Very simple, almost stark, clear in its elements. With a remarkably fine style of carving and some very ancient motifs. For example, the palm trees that you see here on the lintel of the door are very similar to those found at the Church of Amaras, which has been unfortunately in the news lately, very far to the east of Yereruk. So here we have this church, and we look at the elevation of it as it once was. And perhaps with us, it rings a little bell in our memory from last week. Perhaps it reminds us of the Syrian basilica that we looked at, located at Kalbloza, with its towers, central doorway, piercings above. It also resembles this basilica at Mushabbak in Syria, a lesser known basilica, but again, you can see the same ideas, very strong, clean, decorative lines, multiple piercings above the entrance. It's as if the basilica in Armenia was imprinted somehow with the style of basilicas farther to the south in Syria, rather than with the style of the Byzantine basilicas farther to the west. A testimony to the close relationship that there was between the early Armenian church and the Syriac church, a relationship which continues today. In fact, as we look at Yereruk and at these other basilicas, we might be very strongly reminded, or if not, we will recognize it when we see it, of the most famous Christian monument in all of ancient Syria. The vast church that was dedicated to this saint. As you can see, a snake winds its way around the pillar on which he stands, alluding to the many temptations that he suffered as he rose literally higher and higher above the world below. Saint Simeon the Stylite was widely revered in the ancient world. And as you can see, there are going to be similarities, as you will see in a minute, between his basilica and the others we just saw. Now, thanks to recent years of fighting in Syria, not much remains of this great basilica of Deir Sam'an. And yet, you can see similarities to that multi-doored, multi-pierced facade of Yereruk pretty immediately. No surprise, if ruins of this church are so massive, the actual structure itself, when it was still whole, must have been an amazing thing to see. With multiple facades. In part because this was the original church. This is a very, very in-your-face statement of the importance to Christianity of the cross. The cross is everything in this church. Multiple basilicas gathered around that central point allow worshipers to gather literally within the cross, within its embrace, so to speak. as its arms reach out towards those who come towards it. It's an amazing structure. And as you look at it, those of you who are familiar with Armenian church buildings, there's nothing like this in Armenia. Is there?
Never seen that.
Never seen anything quite like this. Maybe because there are kind of obvious practical considerations to putting up a structure like this. It's problematic if you have a very hilly space that you need to put a church on. Getting 4 arms of this magnitude to stick out would be a real challenge. But wait, maybe there is something similar to this in Armenia. Ta-da! The no longer existing church of St. Sarkis Tekor happens to be on the opposite side of the border from Yereruk, not too far from it, but on the Turkish side. This Basilica Church is one of the most valuable monuments for our understanding of Armenian church architecture, how it developed, and what it intends to convey. What has happened to this basilica? Its degradation has been rather alarming. This is what it looked like in the mid-19th century. This is a color retouched photograph by a gentleman who posts these kinds of pictures online. Does a great job, I think. It went from looking like this to an earthquake in 1912, reducing it to what you see on the left. This is what was left 10 years ago. And I doubt there's this much now. This is the apse. This is what's left of the end of the basilica. It's not much. And yet it's such an important monument. And in fact, the oldest inscription in Armenia, in Armenian letters, may come from this church. It's an inscription from around 480. You can see it here over the door. It was noted and photographed because Dekor is such an earth-shattering place, holding details of kind of Syriac-style decoration, but also carrying this wild and interesting inscription, which names the people who built it and allows us to place the construction as early as the 480s. It mentions Katorgos Sahak Mantaguni, or Katorgos Hovanes Mantaguni, and Prince Sahak. So, what has happened to this basilica? Let me go back and retrieve this slide. I should actually just move it down to the one that we just saw. As you can see, the church is a basilica, a normal basilica. And what is the genius thing that the architects of St. Sarkis did to solve the problem that St. Simeon posed in a mountainous landscape? How did the architects take their basilica to the next level of faith expression in a way that was both masterfully theological and masterfully architecturally helpful. As you can see, they simply took the central piece of St. Simeon's 4 basilicas and put it on top of the single basilica, creating the silhouette. Can close your eyes for just a second as I move through these. You get motion sickness. Creating what we would now consider to be the typical Armenian church structure. They took the spike of the cross, the thing that held the arms of the cross together, the central piece of St. Simeon's Basilica, superimposed it on top of their single basilica to create a much more compact, user-friendly, practical, versatile, and one might almost say beautiful structure. A vertical structure has now been made out of what was originally a horizontal structure. So now, instead of there being a procession or a progression from one end of the church to the other, from the door to the judgment seat, there is now a space underneath the central point of the cross. This brilliant discovery took advantage of everything that, as we're going to see a little later in the evening, is important about having the shape of a regular polygonal dome. Armenians, for lack of a better word in English, call it a dome, but it obviously is not round. And it's thanks to the addition of this dome, the superimposition of this central point of the cross, which is located from the interior of the church, not above the priests who are officiating at the liturgy, but above the people. It's thanks to this that the incorporation of the entire physical world within an Armenian church structure became possible. It became possible to have what in Armenian ways of thinking is the universal church, the church as universe. So, at Degor, the Armenian church became, as I just said, not a horizontally axised space, but a vertically oriented one. And that vertical structure will incorporate within itself all of the possible geometric forms with all of their symbolic significances in a way that is all-encompassing but subtle. And from Degor onward, to stand in an Armenian church was not to look towards an impressively distant altar where clergy in special robes were enacting mysteries and a God who is infinitely other is dispensing justice. Instead, an Armenian going into any Armenian church, pretty much henceforth, would be reminded that yes, the church is a courtroom, just the same way that an ancient basilica was. It is the space where the judge sits to hear our case, to right our wrongs. But the judge is not distant. The judge is not only for the special class of men who serve on the bima around his judgment seat. It is with the dimensions and the details of this more intimate, celestial, vertical, mystical kind of justice that Armenians will continue to play for centuries as they adjust the shapes, sizes, materials of their churches, all the while keeping their eye on the developments in their spirituality, their own theology, and that of their neighbors. So there has been a major adjustment, a major harmonization, a major theological shift, physically expressed in the structure of churches in Armenia from this time forward. I'd like to show you one more early Armenian church that underwent exactly this same kind of retrofitting, this same superimposition of a dome onto a basilica. I want to look at it very carefully. Fortunately, I have some good photographs of it. Many of you may actually have been to this church. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. And once we've taken a look at what the verticalization process does to this space, we'll then step back a bit and look at the geometrical shapes that are made possible for inclusion in a church space by having the dome. The Holy Mother of God Church in Odzun has one of the world's most spectacular locations. It stands on a high plain near the village of the same name, not quite at the edge of a 300-foot chasm called the Derbent Gorge. To get to this church, you wind up a narrow road that ascends the face of the cliff. The last time I saw it, there was no guardrail, so it was an interesting exercise in verticality, in literally rising above. And when you get to the church, you realize that this is unlike Degor and other places that have fallen into ruin. Odzun is a success story. Odzun is one of those monuments that has actually improved its condition over time. This is what it looked like in the mid-20th century. Not derelict, certainly, but not well kept. Things growing on the roof, things not in good repair. "15 years ago, it was already looking up. The roofs were clear, the dome not yet, but work was beginning to happen on this church. As you can see, it's a nice, solid basilica. And today, It's a well cared for structure in regular use, as well as being a stop on any pilgrimage route in Armenia, as it should be. One of Armenia's greatest Catholicoses, 8th century head of the church, named Jovan Odznetsi, came from this place. The original basilica, named for the Holy Mother of God, as all Armenian churches were in the beginning, is traditionally ascribed to the days of Saint Gregory the Illuminator himself in the 4th century and King Turdat. And according to tradition, it memorialized a site associated with the Apostle Thomas's time in Armenia. At some point later in the 5th century, or maybe the early 6th, Odzun acquired an 8-sided dome that added to its upwardly stepped roofline, giving it external verticality as well as internal. And as you can see in this aerial shot, the dome imprinted the basilica's exterior with the shape of the cross. The longer arms east and west, the shorter ones to the north and south. And it accomplished this without disturbing the lines of the ancient basilica and its very beautiful arcade. And if you go now to Odzun, the priest in charge of this church will be very happy to welcome you and show you all of the ancient design elements, tell you the entire history. It is a very well loved and very well used structure. One of the things that he will point out to you is the antiquity of the doorway, which, as you can see beneath its simple arch, features a monolithic lintel, one of the hallmarks of an ancient church, as well as inscriptions and other decorative motifs. So what does the verticality of this church look like on the inside? When one enters through this doorway, it jumps up in the air, obviously, it's a very high shot. When one goes through the door into this church, one can see how the arches of what used to be the side, well, they still are, the side aisles of the church, the arches that you can see in the foreground of this picture that look like they're coming out towards you. You can see how those are not disturbed, they continue to perform their function. And they almost seamlessly accommodate the addition of the dome that stands over the second set of arches. And this church is in remarkable condition, considering its antiquity. And thanks to the upward visual pull of the dome, as you're walking down the church towards the altar, your head is automatically moved upward, backward. You can't help it. The light just draws you that direction. The light that's coming into the church from those very carefully sighted windows. And when you find yourself underneath that dome, there's a sudden feeling of openness that comes with standing there at the central point of the cross. And it's a natural thing to simply stand there and enjoy that feeling. That feeling that although you have not yet come to the end of the church that is representative of the courtroom, you are already feeling a sense of freedom, openness, and light. A sensation that if you have it often enough, you do begin to associate with that specific cross point. And once you've taken that moment to realize the connection between that feeling of freedom and the fact that you actually are standing within the cross, it's an amazing realization. I will never forget the moment when I had it. Then it takes a moment more, maybe a lot of moments more, for it to sink in that that central point of the cross, that spot of fastening that ensured the cross's effectiveness as an instrument of death, is actually where the light comes from. It's how the light gets in. And then eventually one begins to notice other things, subtle things, things that could be just purely functional. And of course they are functional, but they could also be more than that. And you start to have the feeling that there is more to this construction than simply the beautiful sensation that you have when you're standing beneath it, or the obvious functionality that has kept this standing intact for all of these years. The central point of the cross that this church has become, the central point of this cross that is the church, is itself supported by four other structurally essential crosses. And I think you probably can see them. Obviously, the four supporting arches that you can see to the right, left, top, and bottom of this photograph are already part of the cross that the church as a whole has become. But beyond that, what would happen if we were to draw an imaginary line across that open space of the dome from one squinch to the other? A squinch is that kind of curved triangular area in each of the four corners of the dome that helps the multi-sided dome to sit comfortably on what's just a square. If you were to draw a line from the lower left squinch to the upper right, and you were to draw another line from the lower right squinch to the upper left, what would you have created? We would have created a cross. Where else could we do that same thing? We could draw a line, say from the window on the left to the window on the right, and another line from the window at the bottom of the screen to the window at the top. And we would have created another cross. Now, if you keep both of those crosses kind of imaginarily drawn in your mind, what do you have in the space between those crosses? So if we have one cross like this, the other cross like this, what have we got in the middle? Oh.
Asterisk.
You've created an asterisk, says someone in this room. And in an asterisk, between the lines of the asterisk, what shape of a space have you created? You've created triangles. Yeah. So you have triangles within this invisible set of crosses that you've drawn here in your mind. And you start to think, oh, that's interesting. We have triangles between the arms of the crosses, and then we have these triangles in the corners. That's interesting. And you look at the triangles in the corners there, you look at the squinches, and you notice, there's a design on those. When you look at it really closely, you can see that each squinch has the same lines incised on it, creating what? In each squinch, there are 6 triangles. And you think to yourself, oh, well, that's interesting. I wonder if that might have anything to do with the 6 days of creation, the thing that actually did create the world, that first original primal span of time. And you think, it would be nice if that was true. Be very interesting. We'll leave that aside for now and go back and look at our crosses. So the cross that frames the dome, the actual arches of the church, one cross from end to side of that. Then you have the cross of the squinches and the cross of the windows, giving us 3 main crosses in all. In other words, 12 points, 4 for each cross. Now, what would be the next logical step in a progression that moves from 4 points to 8 points to 12 points? What should the next step be?
15 points.
16 points. 4 plus 4 is 8, plus 4 is 12, plus 4 is 16, and you look back at that dome and you go, uh-huh. I see in that dome a delicately raised, ribbed design. How many rays would there be in that design?
16.
16. And so when you put a cross on top of a cross, on top of a cross, on top of a cross, you get a star. 16-rayed star with all rays proceeding from a single central point. And here it becomes very interesting. Because single points are important. Everything that exists in space-time, as science tells us now, one of its theories at least, begins from a single point. So I'm sure you've all seen the illustrations of the Big Bang theories. You have this little tiny point in whatever it was in. I don't know if there was no time and space. What was it in? Who knows? But there's this little concentrated point of hyper compressed everything that explodes into variety, and in fact is still moving outward. So whether or not that happens to be true, the idea is that everything does begin with a single point. And those of us who, not mentioning any names, those of us who are old enough to have had the blessing of art classes in grade school, learned about the magic of points with a kind of awesome wonder. So we're going to take a little digression here before we come back to our dome and how it includes the universe, how it confesses silently the Armenian fixation on incarnation. Okay, you have a point. You make it by putting your pen or your piece of chalk or your crayon or whatever it is on the paper. And the teacher says, okay, just pick it up. What have you got there? You have a point. What can you do with your point? Well, not much. It's a point. There it is. But if you put a second point, it's a whole new world. Because what can you do with 2 points?
Connect them with a line.
Oh, yeah. Once you have 2 points, you can create distance. You can begin to create something with potential, because you can move those points as far apart as you want, or you can bring them as close together as you want. You can still connect them, and it doesn't matter how far or how close they are. And that's kind of cool. It's a lot you can do with a line. And then you could consider adding other lines and so on, whatever you want to do with this. So a new frontier has just been crossed. And then, ta-da, what happens? If you add a third point to your repertoire,
You can make a triangle.
what can you now do that you couldn't do before? You can put them like this. Of course, you can also put them, in a straight line, and you can continue to connect your line. But if you choose to arrange them in this manner and then to connect them, you now have a surface. This is quite fantastic. All you've done is add a point. And then you've done the obvious thing with your points, which is to connect the dots. And then you can play with it and you can make it slant one direction. There's still only 3 points. Or with those same 3 points, you can squish it down and make something quite different. You can actually divide your pizza. And now that you have your 3 points, you can even draw it out, play with this kind of a surface. It doesn't really matter what you do with it. You can make it huge, you can make it small. You can drag it all around the room, whatever you want to do with it. And then if you're very adventurous and you add 0.4, what can you do?
Well, if you put in the middle of the triangle, then you can make more triangles.
Yeah. You can put it in the middle of your triangle and make more triangles. Or you can set them up like this. And then when you connect them, you have different ways you can connect them. You can connect them through the middle. If you connect them around the outside, you get this. And then you've got something you can put other things inside of. You have box. And if you put a point in addition to that, suddenly you no longer have a surface. You have 3 dimensions.
3D.
2 dimensions actually, but it looks 3D. Yeah, you have created a miracle. And you've created a second miracle because, as you can see, one side of that figure is still a square, which is what you began with. But because you have pulled the other point out, all of the sides are going to be triangles. And that's weird. Now you have a figure that includes other shapes. It's very interesting. And if you put some of those together, those 3D things, the sky's the limit. Look what you can do with it. Think of the amount of space inside of this. And it's all made out of triangles. Unless you look at it a different way, and then you see other shapes. And you can add to it. There's no limit to how many of these things you can do. And now you have 5-sided shapes coming into this, as well as your triangles. Where the heck did the 5 come from? We didn't even have a 5th point. What happened? How did this come about? Magic. It's the magic of space-time and mathematics. And you can then begin to work inside the space that you have created with nothing but points and lines. And now with that space, you can put other things inside it. You can put a floor, you can put a ceiling, so to speak. Now you can divide up that space that doesn't exist. That space that is nothing but points and lines. And once again, you can see all of those triangles. You can see squashed quadrangles that look like little baklava pieces. You can see 5-sided figures, and then it's all within a 12-sided figure, or eventually a 20-sided figure. And lo and behold, you have an umbrella or something like that. And again, with you put these forms on top of one another, if you stack triangles, squares, pentagons on top of one another, look what happens. Look at what happens. What does that look like? If you were to take hold of that central point and pick it up,
It's top of the church.
you've got your Armenian dome. It's not round. It's the composite of all of the other shapes. And lo and behold, once you have all of those shapes included in your dome, just like that, before you know it, before you realize it, you have a dome that incorporates all of what were known in antiquity as the Platonic solids. We think of the philosopher Plato primarily for things like his cave analogy, how we're all like sitting in a cave watching the shadows that are created by the sun on the wall and trying to figure out what's going on, whereas really all you have to do is get up, turn around, and go outside, and you'll actually see what's going on. And yet we persist in sitting in our cave. So we remember him for things like that, or for his very popular in Armenia treatise called the Timaeus, where he talks about the creation and how the world works, and it's all very exciting. Well, one of his discoveries was that there are only so many actual shapes that make up every piece of creation. And so these are named after him, and you can see that on each one of these shapes is something that symbolizes the element of the natural world that they represent. Because ancient people saw the world as being different combinations of fire, heat. You can see that on the upper left. There's the triangle, the pyramid. Water, which you can see below that as the dodecahedron. Air with the birds on it, the 8-sided figure, the kind of double pyramid. Earth, which he depicted as a cube. It's solid. Put it somewhere, it's not going anywhere. It's 100% stable, unlike the air, which you can see is very unstable. You're gonna have a hard time standing it on its point. And then the fifth one is something that we don't normally consider as one of the elements of the universe. He called it ether. We would call it empty space. And he had a system for why he had assigned each one of these shapes to its specific element. And he pointed out that all of these shapes, whether they're made of triangles, pentagons, whatever they're made of, are actually found in nature. So here are just a few examples that he gives. The bottom of the picture, natural tetrahedrons. The top left, you have a natural dodecahedron, and you've probably eaten one in the not too distant past if you're an Armenian. Next to it, a blue octahedron. To its right, a natural cube. And then last but definitely not least, something that we had a lot of experience with in the past years, even the COVID virus does not stray from the Platonic solids in its own structure. It is an icosahedron. And the Armenians looking at this said, yeah, we need a dome. And we need it to be the kind of dome we have. We don't need any half-round dome to pretend that we're looking up at the stars or something like that. No, this is the dome that we want, the one that includes all of these. The one that brings the universe to the church, puts it on top of the church, where it can filter down through the entire space, through the center point of the cross. I think that's pretty cool. The entire church space and the entire universe is expressed through the central point of the cross, which is where Armenians stand to worship. And the more you look, the more you see them in nature and in architecture. I just like this because it moves. Wow, what is happening with that? Anyway, here they are again. And once again, you can see everything is composed of triangles. The church itself is a cube. It's all put together in the dome. And you know what's really beyond cool about the fact that the dome includes all of this? As if it weren't enough, mind you. If you take any one of these Platonic solids and you build it out, you surround it with other points, and then you connect them all for any of these universal shapes. I could have brought you illustrations of all of them because they're mind-boggling. If you add a circle to this thing, what can you now do? What are you creating? You are giving yourself the option to expand any one of these solids by connecting it to points outside itself in a way that creates the same shapes again on a different plane. And so if we were to go back to our nice little dome, we can begin to see the possibilities. The potential, the options that begin with the actual physical structure, the stones and their shape. But as we imagine these lines going beyond the actual shapes, we could create an entire, if I can dare to say it, we could create from this dome an entire universe of invisible potential points, all of them tethered within the original 16 points of that central star. So if you were to simply take that and those points on the star and connect them in any and all ways possible, infinity would result. Now that I've been rescued by the people in the room from having my computer die. It's actually, it's a good moment, because since we've been talking so much about space and about points in space and about how a dome actually, the way that it is structured for an Armenian church, actually gives you the potential to create a universe as well as to embody a universe. I also want to spend the last part of our time together. We may actually finish a little bit early this evening, and hopefully not because of the computer. I want to bring us back down to earth, to the center of the church again. We spent a lot of time up here looking at the dome, thinking about the way that it includes everything. I'd like to tie that idea back to the constant of the ground level of an Armenian church, back to the courtroom, back to the adyan, the space in which we stand beneath this dome of infinite potential and universal structure. The space we stand in during the liturgy as we anticipate redress from our judge for the imbalances and the harm that has entered or come out of our individual and corporate lives. And to look at the adyan as something that fits together with this idea of the infinite universal dome. I'd like to look for a moment at a piece of writing by the 10th century monastic teacher Anania of Narek, who, if you have heard of him at all, you have probably heard of him as the mentor and the cousin of Narek Monastery's most famous son, Saint Gregory of Narek. Well, Anania is the one who put Gregory on his path of mystical achievement, in part by anchoring him firmly in the church, by tethering him to the solidity and the physicality of the liturgy. And Anania of Narek wrote an entire, it's like an encomium, it's a description of the church. Not of the church as an idea, again, but of the church as a physical structure. And yet it's not a physical description. So he's describing a physical church, but he's not just saying, well, there's this here and there's that there in the church. He says about a specific cathedral, but it could apply to any church structure. He says, if you look at it a slightly different way, the church building itself is a mountain of myrrh. And we think about the myrrh-bearing women, we think about myrrh being brought to Jesus, we think about incense, we think about all of those things. And he moves on from that image to say the church is also a hill of frankincense. So there you have a hill and a frankincense tree. So what is he talking about? And he says, in the church, you should be able to smell. You can smell, not just the physical incense, which is made of this stuff, which is made of frankincense, but you can also smell. You should be able to smell that kind of medicinal, pleasant, but also purgative, purifying smell of the grace that the people in that church have experienced. He says, grace has its own fragrance. And that's why we have incense in the church. It's to remind us of the fragrance that we emit because of our contact with the divine, because of the things that we have experienced in life that have caused us to begin to process the raw stuff of our existence. So after he describes the church as a mountain of myrrh and as a hill of frankincense, Ania goes on to something that is a little strange. He says, the church is a house of wine. We go, not normally in my church. What is he talking about? What does wine do for you? In moderation, obviously. We're not concerned what it does for you if you have it in excess.
Makes me sleepy.
What is the purpose of wine? Why did God create it?
Gladden the heart.
To gladden the heart of man. Yes? So you have the fragrance of grace, the processing of what happens in life. You have the gladness that came, specifically, wine gladdens the heart of man after the flood, when Noah is seriously bereaved, plus has a huge cleanup job on his hands. It's good to have some vines, which he grew, and then we know there were other stories that came out of that. But in any case, the church as a house of wine, the church as a place where after suffering there comes joy, where after the trials that you have that produce the fragrance of the frankincense of grace in your life, there's also joy. And then he adds this one. He says, the church structure is a wedding chamber. Where does your mind instantly go with that? As soon as you hear wedding, church,
The bells.
yeah. Yarakast an maduitslusuin, the beginning of the Badarak, has it instantly, for those who were there early enough in Badarak to hear it. So your mind goes to that instantaneously. Yes, it's built into the experience of Badarak, to the experience of liturgy. The first thing you hear is that we are going into the bridal chamber. The bridal chamber of the unapproachable light. And as the priest is walking in, this is being intoned, the light is streaming in through the center point of the cross up above. What else comes to your mind when you hear wedding feast? Your mind goes to Cana. Your mind goes to the wise and foolish virgins who get locked out of some of them get locked out of a wedding feast. Yeah, all of this kind of imagery, again, has to do with joy. It has to do with the creation of something new. Something that has never happened before. It has, I mean, every wedding is the same and every wedding is unique. And the priest reminds you of this in the ceremony.
Mhm.
But it still seems like a kind of an odd set of things to bring together, Ananya John. What are you talking about? The church building is a mountain of myrrh. It's a hill of frankincense. It's a house of wine, and it's a wedding chamber. And then your biblically literate mind goes, oh, I know where those are coming from. I know where those are coming from. Those are coming from the Song of Songs. Those are coming from that odd book in the Old Testament that is an extended and rather graphic love poem. A book that has troubled many over the centuries, both Jews and Christians. Do we really want to read this in service? What is it doing in the canon? And Ananya says it's in the canon because it is the church. The church is the place where you have joy, fragrant processing of experience between people who love each other, between you as humans, you as a human and God, God as God, and you. And especially where we look at his house of wine image, what does it say? The verse says, it's different from the English for anybody who knows the English by heart of Song of Songs, you know, this is for you. It says, Mudzexi sidun kinvo, garketseki vera im seir. Make me enter a wine house. Make me enter a house of wine. And above me, put love in order. Like the way it should be. And so you think to yourself, wait a minute. The church is a courtroom. Yeah, it is. A place where Armenian worshipers come for redress, where they come to complain about the things that have happened to them and to ask the judge to make it right. As the widow says in her appeal to the unjust judge, avenge me of mine adversary. Take care of my enemy for me. And our enemy, of course, is Satan. And yes, the church functions as a courtroom because the judge, Anania of Natick tells us, loves us. And in the words of Song of Songs 2:6, what we are asking the ultimately loving judge to do is to bring us into this house of wine, wherever it happens to be. And above us who worship, to set his love in order. And I think that when Anania did his little house of wine metaphor in this beautiful homily that he gave for the consecration of this cathedral, when he got to that point, I am sure, he stepped forward and looked up. So we began last week with a basilica, with a completely different way of approaching the courtroom of God. Armenians for a while used that imagery. But then, as they became what they have quintessentially remained ever since, people of the cross, they developed an architectural take on the basilica that completely transformed it from just a courtroom to a house of wine set within the cross. And as we go forward through the rest of the semester, we'll be looking at all of these variations, permutations, architectural games, architectural experiments, as they try again and again to hone this imagery, to make it personal to a specific time or place, or to make it expressive of this reality within a specific situation. So we will also be looking at what's going on in the time periods when certain churches are constructed. How does what is happening in the world outside of the church building affect the way that the building itself is structured? And then how does that structure affect what happens within the church liturgically and in the worship experience?